On a Tuesday morning in April of 1976, a man from the county extension office drove out to Roy Haller's farm in Reno County, Kansas, and told him he was farming wrong. The man's name was Gerald Stokes. He was 32 years old, had a degree in agricultural science from Kansas State, and had been the county extension agent for 3 years. He was genuinely trying to help. Roy was 51 years old and had been farming the same 240 acres since 1952. He was in his south field when Gerald's truck pulled up, checking the winter wheat that was just beginning to green up after a cold March. He walked to the fence line and waited for Gerald to say what he'd come to say. "Mr. Haller," Gerald said, "I've been doing a survey of operations in the county. Looking at yield efficiency," he had a clipboard. "Your per-acre yields are running about 12% below the county average." Roy nodded. "I know." Gerald looked at his clipboard. "A significant part of that gap, in my assessment, comes from your field configuration." He gestured toward the hedge rows that ran along Roy's field edges, thick lines of Osage orange and eastern red cedar, some of them 30, 40 feet wide. "You're losing roughly 18 acres of productive ground to those shelter belts and hedge rows." Roy looked at the hedge rows. His grandfather August had planted the first ones in 1931 during the worst of the Dust Bowl. 3 generations of Hallers had maintained them since. "That's my grandfather's planting," Roy said. Gerald nodded. "I understand the history, but modern farming has moved past the need for those structures. We have better equipment, better seed varieties, better chemical tools. Those 18 acres planted in wheat at current prices," he did arithmetic on his clipboard, "you're leaving somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000 a year on the table." Roy looked at the hedge rows, then at the wheat field behind him, then at Gerald. "What do you see when you look at those hedges?" Roy asked. Gerald looked at them. "Wasted ground," he said honestly. "Old thinking that made sense in the Dust Bowl, but doesn't anymore." Roy looked at them for a moment longer. "Come back in August," he said. "I'll show you something." Gerald came back in August. He stood at the fence line with Roy and watched. Roy didn't say anything for several minutes. He just pointed. Gerald watched, and after a while he began to see what Roy was pointing at. "Let me tell you about August Haller, because this story begins with him." August Haller had homesteaded his 240 acres in Reno County in 1903. He was a German immigrant, like so many Kansas farmers of his era, and he had brought with him an understanding of European agricultural traditions that American farming was in the process of forgetting. The understanding that a farm was not just a field, but an ecosystem, and that the health of the field depended on the health of everything around it. August had farmed successfully through the teens and 20s, had built his operation carefully without debt, had raised a family on land that he understood deeply. When the drought began in the late 1920s and the dust storms started rolling across the Great Plains in the early 1930s, August had watched his neighbor's topsoil blow away and understood something about why. The bare fields had nothing to stop the wind. The monocultures had nothing to break the pest cycles. The farms that had removed every hedge and windbreak and tree line in the name of efficiency had created conditions that efficiency could not survive. In 1931, August began planting. Not crops, structure. Osage orange along the fence lines, eastern red cedar at the field corners, native grasses in the draws and low spots. He planted these things because his grandfather in Germany had told him what a farm needed to sustain itself, and because he was watching the evidence of that teaching play out in the Kansas dust. His neighbors had thought he was wasting time and land. In the middle of the Dust Bowl, when every acre of food production mattered, August Haller was planting hedges. By 1935, when the worst dust storms were stripping the county bare, August's farm had a different character. The hedge rows were still small. 4 years of growth on Osage orange is not much, but they were there. His fields held their soil better than his neighbors. His yields, while poor like everyone's, were less catastrophic. By 1945, when Roy was old enough to understand what he was seeing, the hedgerows were mature enough to show their full character. And their full character was not just wind protection, it was life. Let me tell you about what Roy learned watching those hedges. Because that's the knowledge that mattered in 1988. Roy had grown up working the farm with August through the 1940s and into the early 1950s. August had shown him the hedgerows the way he showed him everything, not with formal explanation, but with patient observation. "Come and watch," August would say. And Roy would watch. What he watched, over years of August's patient pointing, was a community. The Osage orange hedges were not just trees. They were habitat. Ladybugs overwintered in the dense thorny thickets. Lacewings laid their eggs on the hedgerow leaves in spring. Ground beetles sheltered in the native grass strips at the field edges. Parasitic wasps nested in the hollow stems of the native plants. These insects, the ladybugs and lacewings, and parasitic wasps and ground beetles, were, in August's understanding and in Roy's inherited understanding, the farm's immune system. They ate the aphids and the mites and the caterpillars that ate the wheat. They did this work without being asked and without being paid year after year, as long as the habitat that sustained them was maintained. August had a saying that Roy remembered his whole life. "The insects you can't see are working harder for you than the ones you can. Learn what they need and give it to them." Roy had watched for 30 years before he took over the farm. By the time he was farming on his own, he understood the hedgerows not as wasted ground, but as infrastructure, as essential to the farm's function as the irrigation system or the equipment shed. He had never been able to explain this fully to anyone who hadn't watched with him. The knowledge lived in observation, not in words. This was the problem when Gerald Stokes came with his clipboard in 1976. Let me tell you about the years between 1976 and 1988, because they were not easy. Gerald's visit in 1976 had not been unique. The pressure on Roy to modernize his field configuration had been building for years. His neighbors were tearing out hedgerows and fence lines across the county. The Extension Service's recommendations, the implement dealer's advice, the general consensus of the era all pointed in the same direction. Bigger fields, fewer edges, more acres in production. Efficiency. Roy's neighbor to the north, a farmer named Dale Pittman, had removed his grandfather's hedgerows in 1974 and added 22 acres to production. His yields per acre had gone up, his total production had gone up, and he had driven past Roy's farm on the county road and shaken his head at the old-fashioned hedgerows taking up Roy's productive ground. His neighbor to the west, Frank Showalter, had done the same in 1977. Another neighbor, Carl Brenner, in 1979. By 1980, Roy's farm was visually distinctive in the county, the only operation still maintaining substantial hedgerows and shelter belts along its field edges. Driving past on the county road, you could see the difference immediately. Roy's fields were smaller, more irregular, bordered by thick lines of vegetation. His neighbors' fields were large, clean, efficient-looking. Roy's per-acre yields remained below the county average. He knew this. He accepted it. He watched his hedgerows every August and saw what he had always seen, and he kept farming the way his grandfather had shown him. At the grain elevator, at the implement dealer, at the coffee shop in Hutchinson, where the county farmers gathered on winter mornings, Roy Haller's hedgerows were a running topic. Gentle mostly, Roy was well liked, but persistent. "You still got those old windbreaks, Roy. You know you're leaving money out there. Your granddad planted those in the Dust Bowl. Different times now." Roy would nod and drink his coffee and not argue. He had learned from August that you couldn't explain what you hadn't watched. The words were never as convincing as the observation. So he didn't try to convince anyone. He just kept his hedgerows. Let me tell you about 1987, because that's when the warning signs appeared. In the summer of 1987, aphid populations across south-central Kansas began building at unusual levels. The County Extension Service issued advisories recommending monitoring and early chemical intervention. Most farmers in Reno County applied insecticides as a precaution. The aphid numbers came down. The threat seemed managed. Roy had watched his wheat fields in 1987 with particular attention. He had seen aphid populations building earlier than normal. He had also seen, with the practiced eye of a man who had watched his fields for 35 years, an unusual abundance of ladybugs and parasitic wasps in his hedgerows. More than normal. The predator population was responding to the prey population the way it always did. He had not applied insecticides in 1987. His fields had not required them. He had mentioned this to Gerald Stokes, who was still the county extension agent, older now, their relationship having settled into a professional mutual respect over the 12 years since the clipboard visit. At the grain elevator in September, "The aphid pressure was high this year," Roy had said, "but my beneficials handled it." Gerald had looked at him. "You didn't spray?" "No need." Gerald had made a note. He was a careful professional, and what Roy had said was an unusual data point. He didn't dismiss it. He wrote it down. Neither of them knew yet what 1988 would bring. Let me tell you about the summer of 1988, because that's when everything Roy's grandfather had built proved its purpose. The aphid infestation that swept Reno County in the summer of 1988 was unlike anything the county had seen in living memory. The species involved, the greenbug aphid, Schizophis gramenum, arrived in numbers that overwhelmed the chemical tools available at the time. Resistance had been building in the greenbug populations to the most commonly used insecticides. The 1987 season, where aphid populations had been suppressed chemically rather than by natural predators, had inadvertently selected for the most resistant individuals. In July of 1988, wheat fields across Reno County began showing the characteristic yellowing of severe greenbug infestation. Farmers applied insecticides. The aphids died, briefly, and came back in larger numbers. A second application, a third. The resistant population was being selected with every spray. By early August, the situation was becoming a crisis. Field after field in Reno County was showing catastrophic infestation. Yields that should have been 15 to 20 bushels per acre were heading for 5 or 6, or failure. Dale Pittman's fields, the clean, efficient, hedgerow-free fields he had been farming since 1974, were among the worst affected. His 260 acres of continuous wheat, with no habitat for beneficial insects and aphid populations that had been managed with chemicals for years, had almost no natural predator presence. The aphids moved through his fields like a tide with nothing to stop them. Roy Haller's fields were different. Roy had watched the aphid pressure building through June with the same attention he had brought to every summer for 35 years. He had watched simultaneously the ladybug populations in his hedgerows increasing, the lacewing populations, the parasitic wasps whose tiny larvae would parasitize individual aphids and kill them from the inside. He had not sprayed. He had trusted what he had watched for 35 years. By the second week of August, when Dale Pittman's fields were failing and Frank Showalter was looking at a total loss on his west field and the County Extension Service was issuing emergency advisories, Roy Haller's wheat was standing. Not perfect, the infestation had reached his fields too, but the beneficial insect populations that his hedgerows had sustained through the winter and through the previous dry years were present in his fields in numbers that no chemically managed farm could have matched. The ladybugs were there, the lacewings were there, the parasitic wasps were moving through his aphid populations with an efficiency that 12 years of chemical farming on adjacent land had eliminated from every other operation in the county. Gerald Stokes drove out to Roy's farm on a Thursday morning in mid-August. He had been driving the county for 2 weeks, documenting the infestation, trying to help farmers manage an increasingly unmanageable situation. He had seen field after field of failing wheat. He had advised treatment after treatment that provided temporary relief, followed by worse infestation. Roy was in his north field when Gerald arrived. Gerald got out of his truck and stood at the fence line looking at the wheat. It was standing, stressed, yes, the infestation had reached it. But standing and recovering, the aphid populations visibly declining as the predator populations moved through them. Gerald stood at that fence line for a long time without saying anything. Roy walked over from where he'd been checking a stand of wheat near the hedgerow. "The beneficials are working," Roy said. He didn't say it with triumph. He said it the way a farmer reports a field condition, factually, without drama. Gerald looked at the hedgerow. "At the wheat. At the hedgerow again. Your grandfather planted those in 1931, Gerald said. Roy nodded. He said a farm needs its immune system. Gerald was quiet for a moment. "I told you in 1976 you were leaving $3,000 or $4,000 a year on the table." Roy nodded. "I was wrong about what was on that table," Gerald said. "Let me tell you about what happened in the county that fall." Because Roy's farm was not just a personal victory. By the time the 1988 harvest was complete, the scale of the infestation's damage to Reno County agriculture was clear. County-wide wheat yields were down significantly. Several operations that had been carrying debt from the expansion years were in serious financial trouble. A poor harvest on top of high operating costs was, for some farms, The final blow. Roy's harvest was modest, but viable. Not his best year. The infestation had cost him something, but his crop was harvested and his operation was intact. Gerald Stokes had spent the fall doing something he had not anticipated doing when the year began, documenting the relationship between hedgerow presence and infestation outcomes in Reno County. He had visited every farm he could reach, recorded their insecticide use history, their field configuration, their infestation levels and final yields. The pattern that emerged from his data was consistent enough to be uncomfortable for someone who had spent 12 years advising farmers to remove their hedgerows. Farms with substantial hedgerows and shelter belts, and by 1988 there were very few of them left in the county, had consistently lower infestation levels and higher yields than their neighbors. The correlation was not perfect, and Gerald was careful about causation, but the direction of the data was clear. Roy Haller's farm was the most dramatic example, but it was not the only one. Gerald had published his findings in the County Extension Service newsletter that winter. The article was careful and professional. He did not say he had been wrong exactly, but he documented what he had found and noted that integrated pest management approaches, including beneficial insect habitat, merited serious reconsideration in the context of insecticide resistance. The article had caused a reaction in the county. Some farmers had dismissed it. One bad year didn't overturn 12 years of improved efficiency. Others had read it with the attention of men who had just lost money they couldn't afford to lose. Dale Pittman had driven to Roy's farm in November. He had stood in the farmyard and looked at Roy's hedgerows, now bare in the winter, and asked Roy to walk them with him. They had walked the full perimeter of Roy's south field, Dale looking at the hedgerow structure, the native grass strips at the field edges, the Osage orange thickets his grandfather had planted in 1931. "Roy," Dale had said finally, "how did your grandfather know?" Roy had thought about how to answer. "He watched," Roy had said. "He watched what the land did when it was left some room to work, and then he gave it that room." Dale had been quiet for a while, walking. Then he'd said, "I've got $800 saved from the harvest. That's everything after operating costs." Roy had looked at him. "I want to start replanting," Dale had said. "The hedgerows, the field edges." He paused. "I know it'll take years, but I want to start." Roy had looked at his grandfather's hedgerows, 57 years old, full and dense, doing the work August had planted them to do. "I'll walk your fence lines with you," Roy had said, "show you where to start. Let me tell you about the years after, because this is where the story becomes something larger than one farm." Gerald Stokes had become, in the years following 1988, a different kind of extension agent. His 1988 documentation had been picked up by researchers at Kansas State, who had expanded his work into a formal study of beneficial insect habitat in wheat production systems. The study had confirmed what Roy had practiced for 35 years, that habitat for natural enemies of aphids and other wheat pests was a significant factor in the resilience of farm operations against insect outbreaks, particularly where insecticide resistance was developing. Gerald had brought researchers to Roy's farm in 1989 and again in 1991. Roy had walked them through his hedgerows, shown them the overwintering ladybug aggregations in the Osage orange thickets, the lacewing populations in the native grass strips, the ground beetle habitat at the field edges. He had shown them August's original plantings, now 58 years old, and the newer additions Roy had made over the years to maintain and extend what his grandfather had established. The researchers had been thorough and careful. They had measured, sampled, documented. They had asked Roy detailed questions about his management practices, his decision-making, his grandfather's original intentions. At the end of the second research visit, the lead researcher, a woman named Dr. Patricia Hensley from the entomology department, had asked Roy something that he had thought about for a long time afterward. "Mr. Haller," she had said, "your grandfather established this system in 1931. In the middle of the Dust Bowl, he was dealing with drought and wind erosion. How did he end up building something that turned out to be as effective for insect management as for soil conservation?" Roy had thought about it. He wasn't building a system, Roy had said finally, he was building a farm. He understood that a farm needs to be alive, not just the crops, but everything around the crops. The birds and the insects and the plants at the edges. He thought all of that was part of the farm, not separate from it. Dr. Hensley had nodded, writing. "He used to say that the most productive field is the one that takes care of itself," Roy had continued. "You set it up right, and then you get out of its way." He paused. He meant the beneficial insects, the natural cycles. Give them what they need and they'll do the work. Dr. Hensley had looked up from her notes. "That's an accurate description of integrated pest management," she had said, "which as a formal discipline wasn't developed until the 1960s. Your grandfather was practicing it in 1931. Roy had looked at his hedgerows. "He just called it farming," Roy had said. "Let me tell you about Roy's son Thomas, because the story doesn't end with Roy." Thomas Haller had grown up on the farm the way Roy had grown up on it, working alongside his father, watching the hedgerows, learning the observation. That was the foundation of the farm's knowledge. By the time Thomas took over primary management in 1995, when Roy was 70 years old and his knees were telling him what his will was still resisting, Thomas had watched the hedgerows for 20 years. He had watched the 1988 summer. He had been 28 years old, working the farm with Roy, and he had seen what the beneficial insects did that August while the county's other fields were failing. He didn't need to be convinced of what the hedgerows were worth. He had watched the evidence with his own eyes. Thomas had expanded the native plantings in the late 1990s, adding species that the research had identified as particularly valuable habitat for specific beneficial insects. He had worked with Dr. Hensley's research group to document what species were present in different parts of the hedgerow system and what crops they protected. He had also done something Roy had never done. He had started explaining it to his neighbors. Not to argue, not to say his grandfather had been right and theirs had been wrong, just to share what he had watched, what the research had confirmed, what the hedgerows actually did. Some of his neighbors had listened, some had replanted field edges. The county's hedgerow coverage, which had been nearly zero by the mid-1980s, had begun slowly recovering through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. It was slower than the destruction. Removing a mature Osage orange hedgerow took an afternoon. Growing one back took 15 years, but Thomas was thinking about 15 years the way August had thought about 57. Let me tell you one last thing, because it happened recently and it matters. In 2019, Reno County experienced another significant aphid outbreak. Not as severe as 1988, but significant. The county's integrated pest management infrastructure was considerably better than it had been in 1988. The research that Roy's farm had helped generate had changed extension service recommendations, and hedgerow restoration had been happening in the county for over 20 years. Thomas Haller's farm came through the 2019 outbreak with minimal losses. His hedgerows, August's original 1931 plantings, now 88 years old, plus the additions Roy had maintained and Thomas had expanded, supported beneficial insect populations that managed the aphid pressure without chemical intervention. His son Aaron, who was 24 and had been working the farm full-time since finishing his agriculture degree, had stood at the field edge in August of 2019 and watched the ladybugs moving through the wheat. He had watched his grandfather Roy do the same thing in 1988. He had heard the story his whole life. He had also heard something else, a conversation between Thomas and his neighbor's son, who was about Aaron's age, whose family had begun replanting hedgerows a decade earlier. The neighbor's son was asking Thomas questions that Aaron had heard before. The questions about what to plant and where, what to watch for, how long it took for the beneficial populations to establish. Thomas had answered the way Roy had answered Dale Pittman in the farmyard in November 1988. Patiently, specifically, without claiming credit for what his grandfather had figured out. August figured this out in 1931, Thomas had said. We're just keeping it going. The neighbor's son had looked at the hedgerows, 88 years of Osage orange and eastern red cedar, dense and full, home to the beneficial insects that are at that moment working Roy's fields. He stayed for most of the afternoon, watching. Aaron had watched him watching, and understood something his father and grandfather and great-grandfather had all understood in their turn. You can't explain this. You have to watch it. The watching is the knowledge. Roy Haller died in 2004 at the age of 79. He had farmed his 240 acres for 52 years, had kept his grandfather's hedgerows through 12 years of being told he was wrong, had watched the summer of 1988 prove what he had never tried to argue. His obituary in the Hutchinson News mentioned his farm, his family, his community service. It did not mention the hedgerows. Small things that turn out to matter enormously rarely make it into obituaries. But in Reno County, the farmers who were old enough to remember 1988 remembered. And the ones who weren't old enough had heard the story from the ones who were. And August Haller's 1931 plantings were still growing, still working, still doing what August had planted them to do. A farm needs its immune system. Learn what it needs and give it to them. That's what stubborn looks like when it's pointed at something true. Not stubborn about pride or money or being right. Stubborn about watching carefully and trusting what you see year after year, even when everyone around you is certain you're wrong. August Haller planted those hedges in 1931 for people he would never meet. Roy Haller kept them for people he couldn't have imagined. Thomas Haller is keeping them now. The ladybugs don't know any of this. They just overwinter in the Osage orange thickets the way they always have and come out in April and do what they have always done. That's the whole thing. That's all of it.